The morning of October 26, 1942. 3 o'clock. A jungle ridge south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Paige crouched in the mud behind a Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun, watching shadows emerge from the tree line 200 yards below. The humid air carried sounds that every Marine defender had learned to dread. The rustle of equipment, whispered Japanese commands, and then the rising chorus of voices that signaled what was coming. Over 400 soldiers from the Imperial Japanese Army's 29th Infantry Regiment were massing in the darkness for their final push toward the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific. Around Paige, 32 Marines manned 4 of these water-cooled Brownings, weapons that military doctrine had already begun phasing out in favor of lighter, more mobile alternatives. Each gun weighed 47 pounds without its tripod. Each required a 3-man crew. Each featured a bulky water jacket that surrounded the barrel like a metal cocoon, holding nearly 4 liters of water that would be essential for what was about to happen. Because when those Japanese soldiers began their charge up that muddy slope, Paige's obsolete machine guns were about to demonstrate why water cooling wasn't a design flaw. It was the only thing that would let him fire continuously for 3 hours straight without the barrels melting into useless slag. The tactical reality was brutally simple. Henderson Field, the airstrip behind Paige's position, represented the forward edge of American power projection into the Japanese-held Pacific. Whoever controlled that runway controlled the Solomon Islands campaign, and the Japanese understood this with crystalline clarity. For 2 months, they had been feeding troops onto Guadalcanal through nighttime destroyer runs that Marines had nicknamed the Tokyo Express, building strength for the offensive that would sweep the Americans back to their landing beaches and restore Japanese dominance over this contested island. Tonight was supposed to be that decisive push. General Harukichi Hyakutake himself had come forward to command this assault, bringing the 17th Army's artillery and 2 regiments of veteran infantry who had conquered Singapore, Manila, and half of China. These were not green troops or garrison soldiers. These were men who had perfected the art of jungle warfare against enemies who had crumbled before Japanese determination and tactical skill. But they had never encountered defensive fire like what Paige's water-cooled Brownings could deliver. The M1917 had been designed for the static trench warfare of the Western Front in 1917, where German machine gun positions could pour sustained fire into British and French attacks for hours without pause. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapons creator, John Moses Browning, had understood something fundamental about sustained automatic fire that most gun designers missed. Heat was the enemy. When a machine gun barrel fired hundreds of rounds per minute, the metal heated to temperatures that would eventually cause warping, cook off ammunition before it could be chambered, or simply melt the barrel into uselessness. Early rapid-fire weapons like the Maxim gun had solved this problem with water cooling systems, but those British and German designs weighed over 140 pounds when fully assembled, making them nearly immovable once positioned. Browning's genius was creating a water-cooled design that weighed less than half that. The bare gun was just 47 pounds. Add the tripod, and you reached 93 pounds, fully loaded with ammunition. Still heavy by modern standards, but light enough for a crew to manhandle into position when needed. The water jacket itself was an engineering marvel of simplicity. A cylindrical metal sleeve surrounded the barrel with a narrow gap between the 2 surfaces. Water filled this gap, absorbing the tremendous heat generated by sustained fire. As the water heated and began to boil, steam collected in the top of the jacket and vented through a rubber hose into a condensing can, where it cooled back into water that could be poured back into the jacket. This closed-loop system meant a gun could fire almost indefinitely as long as water remained in the jacket and ammunition continued to feed. Tests at Rock Island Arsenal had proven the design could fire 20,000 rounds Without mechanical failure, something no air-cooled weapon could approach. But there was a catch that military planners had begun to see as a fatal flaw. The M1917 was heavy. It was slow to reposition. It required water, which added to the logistical burden of supplying frontline positions. By 1942, the Marine Corps had been transitioning to the lighter M1919, an air-cooled version of Browning's design that weighed just 31 pounds and could be carried by a single man. The air-cooled guns were perfect for offensive operations, where mobility mattered more than sustained fire. They fit the new doctrine of rapid advances and fluid tactics that defined Pacific Island warfare. But they had a critical limitation. After firing 250 rounds, roughly one ammunition belt, an air-cooled barrel needed to be changed or it would overheat and lose accuracy. Changing a barrel under fire required precious seconds and exposed the gunner to enemy observation. For mobile attacks, this was manageable. For defensive positions, facing human wave assaults, it could be fatal. Paige had understood this instinctively from his 6 years as a machine gunner. He had enlisted in 1936 at age 18, hitchhiking 200 miles from his home in Pennsylvania to a Marine Corps recruiting station because the local office had initially rejected him for being underweight. That determination characterized everything about his military service. He had served in the Philippines, where he pitched for the Marine baseball team and compiled a 55-win, 17-loss record. He had guarded American property in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, experiencing firsthand how Japanese infantry tactics emphasized aggressive close-range assault. And he had absorbed the institutional knowledge of older Marines who remembered the Western Front, who had seen what water-cooled machine guns could do to attacking infantry when positioned correctly and supplied with adequate ammunition. When the 7th Marines landed on Guadalcanal in September of 1942, Paige was platoon sergeant, commanding a 33-man machine gun section. His position on the ridge south of Henderson Field was no accident. The terrain funneled any approach from the jungle into a natural killing zone, open ground where attackers would be silhouetted against the sky, while defensive positions remained hidden in the darkness above. Paige had positioned his 4 M1917s to create overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that no section of the approach could be crossed without passing through multiple cones of automatic weapons fire. Each gun crew consisted of a gunner who aimed and fired, an assistant gunner who fed ammunition belts and maintained the weapon, and an ammunition bearer who kept the position supplied from stockpiles buried in waterproof containers nearby. The preparations reflected hard-won lessons from earlier battles on Guadalcanal. In August, a Japanese unit called the Ichiki Detachment had been annihilated attempting to cross the Tenaru River, caught in machine gun crossfire that left over 800 bodies scattered along the riverbank. In September, Japanese forces had nearly broken through at a position called Edson's Ridge, held only after desperate fighting that earned Marine Raider Battalion Commander Merritt Edson the Medal of Honor. Those earlier engagements had taught the Marines that Japanese tactics followed predictable patterns: initial probing attacks to identify weak points, artillery bombardment to suppress defensive positions, then the main assault, hundreds of soldiers charging forward with fixed bayonets, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for the possibility of overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers and fanatical determination. The Japanese called this approach the Yamato spirit, the belief that spiritual strength and willingness to die for the emperor could overcome material disadvantages. It had worked in China, where nationalist forces often broke and ran when faced with such attacks. It had worked in the Philippines, where American and Filipino troops surrendered rather than face continued assault. But it had not worked on Guadalcanal, where Marines refused to retreat regardless of odds, and where American industrial capacity provided weapons specifically designed to stop massed infantry formations. As October 25th turned into October 26th, Paige and his Marines waited in positions they had occupied for weeks. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the red clay soil into a slick mess that made every movement treacherous. Uniforms never dried completely in the tropical humidity. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, carrying malaria that would eventually infect most of the Americans on the island. Food was limited to captured Japanese rice and whatever supplies could be brought ashore during brief windows when American ships controlled the waters around Guadalcanal. But morale remained high because the alternative to holding this position was unthinkable. If Henderson Field fell, the airstrip that allowed American planes to attack Japanese shipping and provide close air support would be lost. The entire Guadalcanal campaign would collapse. The strategic initiative in the Pacific would swing back to Japan. Paige moved from gun to gun in the darkness, checking final preparations. Ammunition belts were laid out in sequence, 250 rounds per belt, 10 belts per position. That meant each gun had 2,500 rounds immediately available, with more stockpiled 50 yards behind the line where ammunition bearers could retrieve them under cover. The water jackets were filled to capacity, the precious liquid sourced from streams and purified with chemical tablets. Each jacket held approximately 1 gallon of water, enough to absorb the heat from 500 to 1,000 rounds of sustained fire before needing replenishment. Paige had positioned additional water cans at each gun, ensuring crews could refill without leaving their positions during the critical first minutes of an assault. The guns themselves represented a transitional moment in weapons technology. The M1917 was essentially a World War I design, pressed into service for a fundamentally different kind of warfare. The cyclic rate of fire was 450 to 600 rounds per minute, depending on the variant. That meant each weapon could theoretically fire 10 rounds every second, though sustained fire was typically delivered in shorter bursts to conserve ammunition and maintain accuracy. The effective range against point targets was 1,000 yards, but against massed infantry formations, the guns could deliver devastating fire out to 1,500 yards or more. The ammunition was .30-06 Springfield, the same full-power rifle cartridge used by American infantry. Each round weighed approximately half an ounce and traveled at 2,800 feet per second when it left the barrel. At close range, the bullets could penetrate multiple targets. At longer ranges, they retained enough energy to cause fatal wounds. What made the M1917 truly lethal in defensive positions was its mount. Unlike handheld weapons that relied on a shooter's ability to maintain sight picture through recoil, the tripod-mounted Browning absorbed recoil forces and allowed the gunner to maintain precise aim even during extended bursts. The tripod itself weighed 53 pounds and featured adjustable legs that could be configured for different terrain and engagement angles. The gun's traverse and elevation mechanisms allowed smooth tracking of moving targets without breaking the sight picture. Most importantly, the mount provided absolute stability that translated to accuracy measured in inches at ranges where infantry rifles struggled to hit man-sized targets at all. Japanese intelligence had failed to identify the concentration of machine guns defending this sector of the American perimeter. Reconnaissance patrols had observed Marines digging fighting positions, but the carefully camouflaged gun emplacements remained undetected. General Hyakutake's battle plan called for his 29th Infantry Regiment to assault straight up the ridge while other units attacked simultaneously at different points along the defensive line. The strategy was sound, in theory. Spread American forces thin by attacking everywhere at once, prevent concentration of defensive fires, create confusion that follow-up waves could exploit. But the plan assumed American weapons would need to be repositioned to meet threats from multiple directions. It assumed that after the initial burst of defensive fire, there would be a pause while crews changed barrels, cleared jams, or waited for overheated weapons to cool. The plan did not account for water-cooled machine guns that could fire without pause for as long as ammunition lasted and crews remained conscious. At 2 in the morning, Paige heard the first sounds of Japanese movement. Not the subtle noises of individual infiltrators, but the unmistakable rustle of hundreds of men moving through jungle undergrowth. Sea ration cans, strung on tripwires, began rattling as enemy soldiers snagged the makeshift early warning system. Radio reports crackled from other sectors of the marine perimeter, confirming what Paige already knew. This was not a probing attack or a limited raid. This was the main assault, the decisive push that Japanese commanders believed would break American resistance and deliver Henderson Field into their hands. The Japanese artillery began at 2:15, shells whistling overhead toward targets deeper in the American position. The bombardment was heavier than anything Paige had experienced in previous engagements, evidence that Hyakutake had indeed brought his 17th Army artillery forward. 100mm and 150mm howitzers, weapons that could demolish bunkers and shatter morale even if they didn't score direct hits. But the artillery fire was poorly coordinated with the infantry assault, falling too far behind the ridge to suppress the machine gun, positions that represented the greatest threat to attacking troops. At 3 o'clock precisely, the Japanese infantry began their advance. 400 men from the 29th Infantry Regiment's lead companies emerged from the tree line and started up the slope toward Paige's positions. They moved in loose formation initially, using available cover as they crossed the initial 200 yards of approach. But the terrain itself worked against them. The ridge rose 60 feet above the jungle floor with few natural features that could provide concealment from observation above. As the attackers climbed higher, they became increasingly visible as dark shapes moving against the slightly lighter sky. Paige waited. The doctrine for defensive machine gun fire emphasized patience, allowing attacking forces to close to ranges where every round would find targets. At 200 yards, he gave the order to open fire. The leftmost gun engaged first, its gunner having acquired targets moving along the steepest section of approach. The distinctive hammering sound of the M1917 echoed across the ridge, a rapid percussion that immediately drew return fire from Japanese rifles and light machine guns positioned at the base of the slope. But those weapons were firing uphill into darkness, essentially blind, while the American gunners had clear sight, pictures of targets silhouetted against the sky. The effect of that first burst was immediate and terrible. Japanese soldiers in the lead ranks fell in clusters as 30-06 rounds found their marks. The water-cooled barrel allowed the gunner to maintain continuous fire without pause, sweeping the weapon in controlled arcs that covered his assigned sector with overlapping cones of fire. Within seconds, the other 3 machine guns joined the engagement, each crew engaging targets in their designated kill zones. The sound was overwhelming. 4 machine guns firing simultaneously created a sustained roar punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of Japanese grenades. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness, green Japanese tracers climbing toward marine positions, while red American tracers plunged downward into the assault formation. The visual effect was mesmerizing and horrifying, a light show that illuminated brief snapshots of the carnage unfolding on the slope below. Japanese soldiers continued advancing, despite the casualties accumulating around them. This was the Yamato spirit in action, men who had accepted death continuing to attack even as their comrades fell. Some made it within 100 yards of the marine positions before being cut down. Others took cover in shell craters or behind fallen trees, attempting to provide covering fire for follow-up waves. But the water-cooled Brownings never stopped firing. There was no pause for barrel changes, no hesitation, while overheated weapons cooled. The guns simply hammered away, consuming ammunition, belt after ammunition. Belt, the water in their jackets absorbing heat that would have disabled air-cooled weapons within minutes. Paige moved between positions, coordinating fires and ensuring ammunition supply kept pace with consumption. The semi-automatic breech mechanism on each M1917 meant spent casings ejected automatically, clattering to the ground in growing piles around each gun. The assistant gunners fed belt after belt into the weapons, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, even in complete darkness. The ammunition bearers shuttled forward with fresh belts retrieved from the stockpiles, timing their movements between bursts of Japanese return fire. The water in the cooling jackets began to boil after the first 5 minutes of sustained fire. Steam vented through the condensing hoses into collection cans, visible as wisps of vapor in the muzzle flashes. This was the system working exactly as designed, extracting heat from the barrels and converting it to steam that could be recovered and recycled. The alternative, air cooling, would have left the guns silent and useless within minutes, their barrels glowing red-hot and incapable of accurate fire. The Japanese assault began to falter after 20 minutes of continuous engagement. The lead companies had been devastated, with casualties approaching 50%. Officers attempting to rally their men became priority targets for Marine riflemen who recognized the importance of decapitating enemy command structures. The follow-up waves encountered growing fields of bodies that blocked approach routes and forced attackers to climb over their own dead. The psychological impact was immense. These were veteran soldiers who had seen combat across Asia, but they had never faced defensive fire of this intensity and duration. At 3:30, a second wave of Japanese infantry attempted to exploit gaps they believed existed in the American line. But there were no gaps. The overlapping fields of fire Paige had established meant that every approach was covered by at least 2 machine guns. Soldiers who thought they had found a safe route discovered too late that they were moving into a kill zone where multiple weapons could engage simultaneously. The water-cooled Brownings continued their work, barrels warm to the touch, but nowhere near the temperatures that would affect accuracy or reliability. This was what water cooling was designed to enable: sustained fire that lasted not for seconds or minutes, but for hours if necessary. The ammunition supply was the only limiting factor, and Paige had prepared for that with the meticulousness of a man who understood that running dry during a human wave assault meant death for everyone in the position. By 4 in the morning, an hour into the engagement, the first Japanese soldiers managed to reach points within 75 yards of Marine positions. At this range, the Browning's effectiveness actually increased because the bullets maintained maximum velocity and the cone of fire remained tightly concentrated. Bursts of 6 to 8 rounds could engage individual targets with devastating effect. The mechanical reliability of the weapons remained perfect. No jammed extracted, no failures to feed, no barrels overheating. Just the steady, methodical delivery of automatic fire that chewed through Japanese ranks with industrial efficiency. The assistant gunners monitored the water level in the cooling jackets by feel, checking the temperature of the metal exterior and adding water when needed from the reserve cans. This was skilled work performed under intense pressure, requiring precise timing to avoid interrupting the gunner's fire. Each crew worked with the coordination developed through hundreds of hours of training, moving through their drills with mechanical precision, even as chaos raged around them. Japanese mortar rounds began falling among the Marine positions, close enough that shrapnel pinged off the steel tripods and water jackets. One round landed between 2 gun positions, wounding an ammunition bearer and briefly disrupting the supply chain. But the system Paige had established absorbed the damage. Another Marine moved forward to take the wounded man's place, and ammunition continued flowing to the guns without interruption. The Japanese tactical problem was becoming insurmountable. They could not advance into the face of sustained machine gun fire. They could not flank the positions because other Marine units covered the ridgeline to either side. They could not suppress the guns with their own weapons because the American positions were too well concealed, and the water-cooled Brownings simply would not stop firing long enough to create an exploitable pause. The assault that was supposed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers was instead bleeding itself dry against defensive fires that never diminished. At 4:30, 90 minutes into the battle, Paige noticed that the second gun from the left had fallen silent. He low-crawled to the position and discovered the entire crew dead or wounded, victims of accurate Japanese rifle fire that had found them despite the darkness and concealment. The gun itself remained operational, its water jackets still warm and its ammunition supply intact. Without hesitation, Paige took the gunner's position, swinging the weapon toward a concentration of enemy soldiers who had reached the base of a small rise 50 yards from the Marine line. The M1917 kicked against his shoulder as he pressed the trigger, delivering short, controlled bursts that required constant adjustment to maintain accuracy. This was not the precise fire possible from a stable tripod mount with a rested gunner, but the weapon's basic reliability meant it continued to function despite the awkward shooting position. Japanese soldiers who had been moving forward under covering fire suddenly found themselves exposed to renewed automatic weapons fire from an angle they thought had been cleared. The physical toll of sustained combat was beginning to affect everyone. Ears rang from the constant noise. Eyes strained to identify targets in darkness, occasionally illuminated by muzzle flashes and exploding grenades. Hands cramped from the repetitive motions of loading and firing. But the water-cooled Brownings themselves showed no signs of fatigue. The barrels remained true, the mechanisms cycled smoothly, and the water jackets continued converting heat into manageable steam that vented into the condensing cans. This was the moment of truth for the obsolete technology that military planners had been phasing out. In a mobile offensive operation, these heavy water-cooled guns would have been a liability, too cumbersome to move quickly, too dependent on scarce water supplies. But in a defensive position, facing a human wave assault, they were transforming into the most effective infantry weapon on Guadalcanal. Not because they hit harder than air-cooled weapons or rifle fire, but because they simply never stopped firing. By 5 in the morning, 2 hours into the engagement, Japanese casualties littered the slope from the tree line to points within 50 yards of the Marine positions. The assault had cost the 29th Infantry Regiment dearly, with killed and wounded approaching 300 men, but they kept coming. Officers with drawn swords urged their troops forward. Soldiers who had accepted death climbed over the bodies of their comrades. The Yamato spirit demanded nothing less than complete commitment, regardless of casualties or tactical futility. Paige continued directing fire from his commandeered gun position, alternating between short bursts at visible targets and longer sweeps across areas where he suspected Japanese soldiers were taking cover. The water in the cooling jacket needed replenishment every 15 minutes now, evidence of the sustained fire rate. But the system worked. Water went in, steam came out, and the barrel remained cool enough to maintain accuracy. An air-cooled weapon firing at this rate would have been a twisted piece of useless metal within an hour. The ammunition supply was becoming a concern. Each gun had expended over 1,500 rounds, more than half their immediate stockpile. Ammunition bearers made increasingly dangerous trips to the rear supply dumps, timing their movements to avoid Japanese machine gun fire that swept the ridgeline at irregular intervals. One bearer was hit during a resupply run, dying within sight of the gun position he was trying to reach. Another Marine immediately took his place, understanding that the guns could not stop firing without inviting disaster. At 5:30, with dawn beginning to gray the eastern sky, the Japanese launched what appeared to be their final coordinated push. Fresh troops from the regiment's reserve companies joined survivors from the earlier waves in a desperate attempt to reach the American positions. Before daylight fully revealed their positions, over 200 men charged forward simultaneously, accepting that many would die, but believing that enough would survive to overwhelm the defenders. Paige's 4 machine guns, 3 now manned by composite crews, after casualties had decimated the original gunners, responded with maximum fire. The barrels glowed dimly in the pre-dawn darkness, visible evidence of the temperatures being generated inside the water jackets. But the cooling systems held. Water continued circulating, steam continued venting, and the guns continued firing. The Japanese charge collapsed 50 yards from the Marine line, broken by automatic weapons fire that cut down attackers faster than follow-up waves could replace them. As the sky lightened, the full extent of the carnage became visible. Bodies lay in clusters where machine gun fire had caught them in the open. Individual soldiers sprawled in the vegetation where they had fallen while attempting to find cover. The approaches to the ridge looked like a slaughterhouse, visual testament to what sustained automatic fire could do to infantry formations lacking armored support or effective suppressive weapons. But the battle was far from over. The Japanese had not given up. They had simply paused to reorganize, preparing for the renewed assault that would begin when they gathered strength for another push. And Paige's Marines, exhausted from 2 hours of constant combat, knew that the water-cooled Brownings that had saved them so far would need to continue their work for as long as the enemy kept coming. The obsolete weapons that headquarters wanted to replace had just proven their worth in the most demanding test possible. But the true test was still ahead, because sunrise would bring visibility that allowed Japanese commanders to identify American positions with precision. The next phase of the battle would determine whether water cooling was merely an interesting technical solution or the crucial advantage that made sustained defense possible against overwhelming odds. The dawn of October 26 revealed a tactical situation that was both better and worse than Paige had anticipated. Better, because the Japanese assault had stalled with devastating casualties. Worse, because daylight would allow enemy observers to pinpoint the exact locations of the machine gun positions that had inflicted such damage. Japanese artillery officers could now direct accurate fire onto the ridge, and snipers could begin targeting individual Marines with the precision impossible in darkness. The breathing space lasted exactly 17 minutes. At 5:47, the first Japanese artillery shells began falling on the ridge with improved accuracy, not the random harassment fire from earlier, but concentrated barrages targeting specific sections of the Marine defensive line. One round landed directly between Paige's first and second gun positions, the explosion showering both crews with rock, fragments, and dirt. The first gun's water jacket took shrapnel that punctured the cooling system, water streaming from multiple holes that would drain the jacket within minutes. The gun could still fire, but without the cooling water, it would overheat rapidly and become useless. The gunner, Corporal James Henderson, made a decision that reflected both his training and his understanding of their desperate situation. He continued firing in short, precise bursts, knowing each round brought his weapon closer to mechanical failure, but determined to extract maximum effectiveness before the inevitable happened. The barrel began to glow red within 5 minutes, visible even in the growing daylight. At 8 minutes, the first misfire occurred as heat caused a round to cook off prematurely. At 9 minutes, the barrel warped enough that accuracy became impossible. Henderson abandoned the weapon and moved to assist the crew of the second gun, which remained operational despite damage to its tripod. This was the fundamental vulnerability of even water-cooled weapons. They were durable and reliable, but they were not invulnerable. A single piece of shrapnel in the right place could transform the most sophisticated cooling system into dead weight. The loss of one gun reduced Paige's defensive fire by 25%, creating a gap in the overlapping fields of fire the Japanese infantry would inevitably exploit. But 3 guns remained operational, and 3 water-cooled Brownings could still deliver 1,800 rounds per minute of sustained fire if the crews held together and ammunition continued to flow. At 6:15, the Japanese launched their morning assault. This time, they came from multiple directions simultaneously, having identified weak points in the Marine perimeter during the pre-dawn fighting. 2 companies, approximately 300 men, advanced toward Paige's sector, while additional forces struck positions held by Company F to the east. The tactical coordination was better than the night attacks, with Japanese light machine guns providing covering fire, while infantry maneuvered in small groups rather than massed formations. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. To reach the American positions, they had to cross open ground under observation from elevated defensive positions, and those positions still held water-cooled machine guns that could fire continuously without the pauses required by air-cooled weapons. The 3 remaining Brownings opened fire as soon as targets entered effective range, their crews having learned, during the night, exactly where to aim for maximum effect. The Japanese advance slowed immediately as lead elements took casualties, and following troops sought cover. Paige had moved to the 3rd gun position after ensuring Henderson was integrated with the 2nd gun's crew. This weapon had been firing almost continuously for over 3 hours, with only brief pauses to change ammunition belts and refill the water jacket. The barrel showed no signs of overheating, no loss of accuracy, no mechanical failures of any kind. It was performing exactly as John Moses Browning had designed it to perform back in 1917, when he envisioned a machine gun that could sustain fire throughout the prolonged bombardments and massed attacks of Western Front warfare. The irony was not lost on Paige. The weapon military doctrine considered obsolete, too heavy and too slow for modern mobile warfare, was proving ideal for exactly the kind of defensive battle the Marine Corps faced on Guadalcanal. The Pacific Campaign was supposed to be about rapid amphibious assaults and aggressive offensive maneuvers. Instead, it had become a grinding war of attrition where defenders held key terrain against numerically superior attackers. And in that kind of warfare, water cooling was not a liability. It was a decisive advantage. At 6:30, a Japanese mortar round scored a direct hit on the second gun position. The explosion killed the gunner instantly and wounded both the assistant gunner and Henderson, who had been feeding ammunition. The weapon itself was destroyed, its receiver cracked, and its barrel blown clear of the mount. That left Paige with 2 operational Brownings to cover an approach that had been designed for 4 guns worth of overlapping fire. The mathematics of defensive firepower had just shifted decisively in favor of the attackers. Japanese officers recognized the change immediately. With 2 of the American machine guns silenced, gaps had opened in the defensive fire that small units could exploit by maneuvering quickly between covered positions. Squads began advancing using fire and movement tactics, one element providing covering fire while another rushed forward. The tactic was sound and would eventually succeed if the remaining guns could not maintain sufficient fire density to suppress multiple approaching elements simultaneously. Paige understood this with the clarity that comes from years of machine gun experience. 2 guns could not cover the same frontage as 4, not when the enemy had adapted their tactics to exploit gaps in the fire. He had 2 choices: pull back to a more defensible position with a narrower front, or find a way to increase the fire density from his remaining weapons. Pulling back meant conceding ground and exposing Henderson Field to closer Japanese observation. It was not an option. That left increasing fire density, which meant operating one of the guns himself while directing the other to shift sectors rapidly to cover the widest possible front. He moved to the abandoned 3rd gun position, where the weapon sat silent after its crew had been killed by artillery fire 20 minutes earlier. The Browning was still operational, its water jacket intact and half full, ammunition belts scattered around the position from the crew's last desperate minutes. Paige checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, traverse and elevation mechanisms functional, belt feed clear, barrel cool to the touch despite previous firing. The gun was ready. What it lacked was a 3-man crew to operate it at maximum effectiveness. Paige had to become that crew. Gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer all compressed into one exhausted Marine who had not slept in over 24 hours and had been in continuous combat for more than 3 hours. The physical demands would be enormous, the mental strain even greater. But the alternative was watching Japanese soldiers overrun his position and roll up the entire defensive line. He settled behind the gun and identified targets through the sight mechanism. A squad of Japanese infantry was maneuvering along a shallow ravine 70 yards from his position, using the terrain to mask their approach from the remaining crew-served weapon. Paige traversed the Browning to cover the ravine and pressed the trigger. The weapon responded instantly, delivering a 6-round burst that caught the lead Japanese soldier in mid-stride. The man went down, and his squad mates immediately took cover. But cover from one gun's line of fire meant exposure to another's. Paige had positioned himself so that targets avoiding fire from the 4th gun position would present themselves to his weapon. He traversed again and fired another burst, then another, methodically engaging each covered position in sequence. The Japanese soldiers were caught in a crossfire from weapons they thought had been silenced, pinned in place by automatic fire that never seemed to stop. The water-cooled barrel made this possible. An air-cooled gun firing at this rate would have needed a barrel change within minutes. The pause required for that change would have allowed the Japanese squad to resume movement and reach positions where they could assault the gun directly. But the water jacket absorbed the heat, converted it to steam, and vented it harmlessly into the condensing can. The gun never stopped firing long enough to create an exploitable gap. At 7 o'clock, the tactical situation reached its critical point. Company F's position to the east had been penetrated by Japanese infantry who had fought their way past the defensive line in hand-to-hand combat. Enemy soldiers were now behind Paige's flank, threatening to encircle his position and cut off ammunition resupply. Radio communications with battalion headquarters confirmed the worst. The defensive perimeter was collapsing in multiple sectors. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Reinforcements were on the way, scraped together from headquarters personnel and rear area troops, but they would not arrive for at least 30 minutes. 30 minutes during which Paige and his remaining Marines had to hold their positions against Japanese forces that now had local superiority in numbers and tactical position. The two operational machine guns became the critical factor. If they fell silent, the entire ridge would fall within minutes. If they maintained fire, there was a chance the position could hold until help arrived. Paige found himself making the same calculation his gun was making. How long could he sustain this level of effort before exhaustion forced a pause? The Browning had water cooling to manage heat. He had only adrenaline and the knowledge that stopping meant death for everyone on this ridge. He fired, burst after burst, his hands moving through the loading sequence with mechanical precision, even as his mind tracked the larger tactical picture. Japanese soldiers to his front, to his right flank, and now emerging from the vegetation behind Company F's collapsed position to his east. The fourth gun, still manned by its original crew minus the assistant gunner who had been killed earlier, shifted fire to engage the Japanese troops threatening from the east. That left Paige's weapon as the primary defense against frontal assault. He became both gunner and tactical commander, firing at immediate threats while mentally calculating where the next threat would emerge and how long his ammunition would last at this expenditure rate. The M1917 consumed ammunition at a frightening pace when fired continuously. Each belt held 250 rounds. At sustained fire rates, that meant one belt every 30 to 40 seconds. Paige had 8 belts in his immediate area, 2,000 rounds. At his current rate of fire, that gave him perhaps 8 to 10 minutes before he would need to retrieve ammunition from the stockpile 50 yards behind his position. 8 minutes during which he could not leave the gun or Japanese infantry would overwhelm the position in seconds. The water jacket was heating faster now, reflecting the sustained high rate of fire. Steam vented continuously from the condensing hose, and the exterior of the jacket was warm to the touch, but the system held. The barrel remained cool enough to maintain accuracy. The mechanism continued cycling smoothly. The gun that had been designed for the static warfare of 1917 was proving its worth in the mobile chaos of Pacific Island combat. At 7:15, an ammunition bearer from the 4th gun position low-crawled across the 30 yards, separating the two weapons, dragging 2 fresh ammunition belts. The young Marine, Private Robert Miller, was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his left leg, but moving with determined purpose. He reached Paige's position, dropped the belts, and immediately began the return trip for more ammunition. This was the human element that made the weapon system function. Marines who understood that keeping the guns firing was more important than their personal safety. Miller made 3 round trips before a Japanese sniper's bullet found him halfway back to the 4th gun position. He fell face down in the mud, one hand still gripping an ammunition belt. Paige watched him fall, felt the familiar rage and grief that came with losing men under his command, and then returned his attention to the gun sight. Grieving would come later, if there was a later. Right now, the Browning needed targets and he needed to find them. The Japanese assault was losing momentum again, broken against defensive fire that refused to diminish despite the casualties inflicted on the gun crews. But they were not retreating. They were reorganizing for another push, concentrating their remaining strength for a final overwhelming assault. Paige could see officers gathering soldiers at the base of the ridge, pointing toward the American positions, working to rebuild the shattered morale of men who had watched their comrades cut down by machine gun fire for over 4 hours. At 7:30, Major Odell Connolly arrived with 17 Marines scraped together from battalion headquarters. Bandsmen, clerks, cooks, and communication specialists, men who had trained as infantry but spent recent months performing support duties. They were not veteran combat troops, but they carried rifles and knew how to fire them. More importantly, they could serve as ammunition bearers and allow the depleted gun crews to focus on their weapons. Connolly assessed the situation with a veteran's eye. 2 functional machine guns, 4 dead gun crews. Approximately 200 Japanese soldiers visible at the base of the ridge with more likely concealed in the jungle. The tactical math was brutal. 17 fresh Marines and perhaps 6 survivors from Paige's original 33-man section holding a position designed for a full platoon. But those 2 water-cooled Brownings were still firing, and as long as they fired, the position could hold. He deployed his Marines to cover the gaps in the defensive line left by casualties, positioned ammunition bearers to support both gun positions, and established a small reserve that could respond to penetrations. Then he moved to Paige's position and assessed the man himself. Paige was past exhaustion, operating on pure will and muscle memory. His eyes were bloodshot from smoke and strain. His hands showed signs of tremor when not gripping the gun, but his fire discipline remained perfect, short bursts at identified targets rather than the panic spraying of an inexperienced gunner. "How's the gun?" Connolly asked, his voice barely audible over the hammering of the Browning. "Good," Paige replied, not taking his eyes from the sight. "Water jackets holding. Barrels still true. Just need more ammunition." Connolly detailed 2 of his headquarters Marines to serve as Paige's ammunition bearers, ensuring the gun would not fall silent due to supply failure. Then he moved to the 4th gun position and made similar arrangements. The defensive system was rebuilt, fragile but functional, capable of maintaining fire as long as the guns held together and men remained conscious to operate them. At 8 o'clock, exactly 5 hours after the initial Japanese assault began, enemy artillery fell silent. The sudden absence of incoming fire was almost as unsettling as the bombardment itself. In the quiet, the sounds of individual weapon fire became distinct. The crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles, the heavier bark of American M1 Garrons, and above all, the sustained hammering of the 2 water-cooled Brownings that had become the backbone of the entire defensive position. Then came the sound every Marine had been dreading. Hundreds of Japanese voices, rising in a unified battle cry. The traditional Banzai shout that signaled a final, desperate charge. The assault that was supposed to have taken place at night, supported by surprise and darkness, was now happening in full daylight, with the attackers visible across their entire approach. It was tactical desperation born from the knowledge that this was the last chance to break through before American reinforcements made the position unassailable. Over 300 Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line and began climbing the ridge. They came in waves, each line separated by 15 to 20 yards, officers with drawn swords leading from the front. This was the Yamato spirit in its purest form, men who had accepted death, seeking only to inflict maximum casualties before falling. The sight was both terrifying and magnificent, a human wave that seemed unstoppable through sheer determination and willingness to die. Paige opened fire at 200 yards, the maximum effective range where the Browning could still deliver accurate plunging fire. The 4th gun engaged simultaneously, both weapons traversing methodically across the assault formation. Japanese soldiers fell in clusters where the fire was concentrated, individual soldiers where bullets found isolated targets. But the charge continued. Men climbed over the bodies of fallen comrades. Wounded soldiers continued forward until blood loss or additional wounds brought them down. The psychological impact that had broken enemy formations across Asia had no effect on water-cooled machine guns that simply continued their mechanical work regardless of the tactical situation. The Japanese reached 150 yards, 100 yards, 75 yards. At this range, the Browning's fire was devastating, each bullet retaining maximum kinetic energy and the cone of fire remaining tightly concentrated. Paige fired burst after burst, the water jackets so hot now that steam vented continuously, and water had to be added after every 2 ammunition belts. But the cooling system held. The barrel remained functional. The gun continued delivering accurate fire, even as Japanese soldiers closed to ranges where their own weapons could engage the American positions effectively. At 50 yards, the assault faltered, not because Japanese courage failed or determination wavered, but because the casualties had become unsustainable even by the ruthless mathematics of Banzai tactics. Over 200 men lay dead or dying on the slope, and the survivors lacked the strength to cross the final distance against machine gun fire that never paused, never diminished, never gave them the exploitable gap they needed to close with the defenders. Japanese officers attempted to rally their men for a final push, But the troops would not move. They had reached the limit of what human beings could endure. Even men trained from childhood to accept death without question. The assault broke. Survivors began falling back down the slope, moving in small groups that used terrain to mask their withdrawal. The banzai charge that was supposed to sweep the Americans from the ridge had been stopped cold by 2 water-cooled machine guns and the exhausted Marines who refused to let them fall silent. Paige kept firing at withdrawing targets until they reached the tree line and disappeared into the jungle. Only then did he release the trigger and allow himself to assess the weapon he had been operating for the past 3 hours. The water jacket was nearly empty, drained by continuous steam venting. The barrel showed heat discoloration, but remained straight and functional. The mechanism had cycled flawlessly through over 3,000 rounds. Not a single malfunction, not a single failure to feed or extract. The obsolete weapon, designed for a previous war, had proven it could sustain fire longer and more reliably than any air-cooled alternative. He looked down the ridge at the carnage spread across 500 yards of approach. Bodies lay in windrows where concentrated machine gun fire had caught them. Individual soldiers sprawled in vegetation where they had fallen while seeking cover. Equipment scattered everywhere. Rifles, grenades, helmets, the personal possessions that soldiers carried into battle, the visual evidence of what sustained automatic fire could do to infantry formations was overwhelming and horrible. At 8:30, Marine reinforcements arrived in strength. The 7th Marines were coming forward, moving through Paige's position toward the Japanese lines to exploit the enemy's defeat. Chesty Puller himself appeared, his legendary presence somehow larger than life despite his unremarkable physical stature. He stopped at Paige's gun position and looked at the weapon, the piles of spent brass casings, the empty ammunition belts, and the exhausted sergeant who had operated it for hours. "How many?" Puller asked, his voice carrying the flat effect of a man who had seen too much combat to be surprised by anything. "Don't know, Colonel," Paige replied. "A lot," Puller nodded. "Get your people sorted out. We're counterattacking in 30 minutes. The counterattack was almost anticlimactic. After the intensity of the defensive battle, Japanese forces were scattered and disorganized, lacking the command structure and tactical cohesion necessary for effective resistance. The Marines advanced methodically, clearing positions and eliminating isolated pockets of enemy soldiers who attempted to defend terrain they could no longer hold. By noon, American forces had pushed half a mile beyond the original defensive perimeter, establishing new positions that provided greater depth and security for Henderson Field. The casualty count was compiled throughout the day as Marines and Army personnel moved across the battlefield, documenting the results of the night's fighting. 98 Japanese bodies were found on the ridge itself, soldiers who had reached the Marine positions before being killed in close combat or cut down by machine gun fire at point-blank range. Another 200 lay on the approaches, victims of the sustained fire that Paige's water-cooled Brownings had delivered throughout the 5-hour engagement. American casualties were significant but manageable. 26 Marines killed and 11 wounded from Paige's original section, plus 3 dead and 5 wounded from the reinforcements who had arrived during the battle. The disparity in loss ratios reflected both the advantage of defensive positions and the effectiveness of weapons specifically designed for sustained fire. The water-cooled Brownings had proven their worth in the most demanding test possible. Intelligence officers interrogated captured Japanese soldiers throughout the following week, documenting their reactions to the American machine gun fire. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, wounded in both legs by .30-06 rounds, described the assault as unlike anything he had experienced in 5 years of combat across China and the Pacific. "The American guns never stopped," he said, through an interpreter. "We were told they would overheat and need to pause. We were told we could rush them during the pauses. But there were no pauses. The guns just kept firing." That statement captured the essential truth of what had occurred on the ridge south of Henderson Field. The water-cooled M1917, dismissed by modern military doctrine as too heavy and too slow, had demonstrated capabilities that no air-cooled weapon could match. The ability to sustain fire for hours without barrel changes or cooling pauses had been the decisive factor in stopping an assault that should have overwhelmed the thinly held American positions. General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army from his headquarters several miles away, received the casualty reports with growing recognition that his offensive had failed catastrophically. 3 regiments had been committed to the assault on Henderson Field. All 3 had been repulsed with devastating losses. The 29th Infantry Regiment alone had lost over 600 men and killed and 300 wounded, casualty rates that effectively eliminated it as a combat-effective unit. And the objective, Henderson Field itself, remained firmly in American hands, with its runways operational and its aircraft continuing to interdict Japanese supply lines. The strategic implications became clear over the following weeks. Without the ability to recapture Henderson Field, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal could not be adequately supplied or reinforced. The Americans, conversely, could use the airfield to support ground operations and attack Japanese shipping with increasing effectiveness. The balance of power in the Solomon Islands had shifted decisively, and the battle for Henderson Field would eventually be recognized as the turning point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. But the immediate aftermath was less dramatic than the strategic analysis that would come later. Paige and the surviving Marines from his section spent October 27th cleaning weapons, burying dead, and trying to process what they had just experienced. The water-cooled Brownings that had saved them sat silent now, their barrels cool and their water jackets empty. The weapons looked ordinary, even obsolete, sitting on their heavy tripods with ammunition belts scattered around them. Nothing about their appearance suggested the devastating effectiveness they had demonstrated. Paige received a field commission to second lieutenant in December of 1942, formal recognition of his performance during the battle. The commission ceremony was brief and understated, conducted at a forward position with artillery rumbling in the distance. General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, presented the commission personally and added a private comment that Paige would remember for the rest of his life. "You held when everyone else said it couldn't be done. That's what Marines do." The Medal of Honor came later, presented in Melbourne, Australia, in a ceremony that included 2 other Guadalcanal recipients, John Basilone and Merritt Edson. The citation praised Paige's extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, his willingness to man multiple machine guns after his crews were killed, and his leadership during the counterattack that followed the defensive battle. But the citation did not mention water cooling. It did not explain that the weapons he operated could sustain fire because of a cooling system that military doctrine considered obsolete. That technical detail was lost in the broader narrative of individual heroism and American determination. The M1917 continued in service throughout World War II, fighting in every Pacific theater engagement from Tarawa to Okinawa. Production reached over 120,000 units by war's end, with over 2 million water-cooled barrels manufactured to support sustained fire operations. The weapon proved particularly effective in the static defensive positions that characterized Pacific Island warfare, where Japanese banzai tactics created exactly the tactical conditions the Browning had been designed to counter. But the military establishment never fully embraced the lessons of Guadalcanal regarding sustained fire requirements. The M1919 air-cooled variant remained the standard infantry machine gun, lighter and more mobile, but incapable of the sustained fire that water cooling enabled. The M60, introduced in the late 1950s, continued the air-cooled tradition with all its limitations. Not until the M240 machine gun entered service in the 1980s did American forces have a truly sustained fire-capable squad automatic weapon, and, even then, it required quick-change barrels rather than water cooling. Paige himself never claimed that his weapons were superior to newer designs. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he emphasized crew training and tactical positioning over technical specifications, but he always defended the M1917 against criticism that it was outdated or excessively heavy. "That gun saved my life and the lives of every Marine on that ridge," he said in a 1998 interview. "It fired for 5 hours straight, without a single malfunction. Show me an air-cooled gun that can do that. The 4 water-cooled Brownings that defended the ridge south of Henderson Field on October 26, 1942, had varying post-war fates. The first gun, damaged by shrapnel that punctured its water jacket, was repaired at a rear area depot and saw subsequent service on New Britain. The second gun, destroyed by a direct mortar hit, was scrapped for parts. The third gun, which Paige operated during the critical hours of the engagement, was captured as a war trophy by a Japanese patrol during a subsequent action, and its final disposition remains unknown. The fourth gun survived the war and was eventually donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War, where it remains on display with a placard describing its role in the battle for Henderson Field. Mitchell Paige retired from the Marine Corps as a colonel in 1964 after 28 years of service. He had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, earning numerous decorations and establishing himself as one of the most respected officers in the Corps. But he was always most closely identified with that October night on Guadalcanal, when a platoon sergeant and 4 obsolete machine guns held a ridge against overwhelming odds. He died in 2003 at age 84, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew hundreds of Marines, from privates to generals, men who understood that what Paige had accomplished represented the essence of Marine Corps values: determination, tactical skill, and absolute refusal to yield, regardless of circumstances. The story of the battle for Henderson Field entered Marine Corps legend as an example of how individual courage and proper weapons employment could overcome numerical disadvantage. But the technical lesson, the specific reason why Paige's guns could sustain fire when air-cooled, weapons would have failed, remained obscure. Military historians focused on tactics and courage, not on the physics of heat management and the engineering brilliance of water-cooled barrel systems. Yet that cooling system was the critical factor. Without it, the M1917 would have been just another machine gun, capable of impressive bursts of fire, but requiring pauses that attacking infantry could exploit. With water cooling, it became something fundamentally different, a weapon that could maintain sustained fire for as long as ammunition lasted and crews remained conscious. In the specific tactical conditions of Guadalcanal, that capability was decisive. The Japanese never attempted another major ground assault on Henderson Field after October the 26th. Their subsequent operations on Guadalcanal focused on defensive positions and delaying actions as American forces gradually expanded their perimeter. The turning point had come on a muddy ridge where obsolete technology proved superior to modern alternatives because the tactical conditions favored sustained fire over mobility. John Moses Browning died in 1926, 16 years before Mitchell Paige used a Browning-designed weapon to change the course of the Pacific War. The inventor never knew that his water-cooled machine gun, designed for the trenches of France, would prove equally effective in the jungles of Guadalcanal. But the fundamental engineering principles he applied in 1917 remained valid in 1942. Manage heat effectively, and you can sustain fire indefinitely. Fail to manage heat, and even the most advanced weapon becomes useless when you need it most. The ridge south of Henderson Field today shows little evidence of the battle fought there over 80 years ago. The jungle has reclaimed the ground, covering the shell craters and fighting positions with tropical vegetation. Tourists visit Guadalcanal to see Henderson Field itself, now a civilian airport serving the Solomon Islands capital of Honiara. Few venture to the ridge, where Mitchell Paige and his water-cooled Brownings held the line against 400 Japanese soldiers. But for those who study military history and weapons technology, the battle remains relevant. It demonstrates how specific technical characteristics can become decisive under particular tactical conditions. It shows that obsolete technology is not always inferior technology, but rather technology optimized for conditions that modern doctrine has abandoned. And it proves that sustained fire capability, the ability to keep shooting when everyone else has to pause, can be the difference between victory and defeat. The M1917 Browning was phased out of active service in the late 1950s, replaced by lighter air-cooled weapons that better fit Cold War mobility doctrine. The remaining guns were sold as surplus, given to Allied nations, or preserved in museums. The era of water-cooled machine guns ended, replaced by quick-change barrel systems and lighter materials that addressed some, but not all, of the heat management challenges Browning had solved with his water jacket design. But on October 26, 1942, for 5 critical hours, on a ridge in the Solomon Islands, water cooling was not obsolete technology. It was the cutting edge of defensive firepower. It was what allowed 33 Marines, reduced to less than a dozen effective fighters, to hold a position against 400 determined attackers. It was what kept Henderson Field in American hands and prevented a Japanese breakthrough that could have changed the entire course of the Guadalcanal campaign. Mitchell Paige understood this in a way that transcended technical specifications or doctrinal debates. He had operated that weapon under the most demanding conditions imaginable. He had felt the heat building in the barrel and seen the steam venting from the cooling jacket. He had witnessed the weapon continue firing when air-cooled guns would have failed. And he had lived to tell the story because John Moses Browning, working in a quieter era before World War I, had understood something fundamental about sustained automatic fire that later weapons designers would only rediscover through painful experience. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.